I'm Yasmine Chinwala. I'm a partner at a think tank called New Financial. Some of you may know me from the work we do as HM Treasury's data partner on the Women in Finance Charter. I'm delighted to chair the discussion this morning. We have a very impressive panel with a wealth of board experience to really, I hope, bring the research findings to life. So we have Sir Douglas Flint, Chair of Aberdeen of IP Group and the Royal Marsden Hospital and Charity, former Chair of HSBC. Denise Wilson, OBE, who is Chief Executive of the FTSE Women Leaders Review, focused on increasing female representation on FTSE 350 boards and senior leadership positions. Denise has also served on several corporate charitable boards, including Ecclesiastical Insurance and the Royal Academy of Arts and Friends, of Arts Friends, sorry. And we have Pavita Cooper, who's Vice Chair of the 30% Club and founder of More Difference, who is a board advisor, also served on boards, a variety of boards, including some charitable boards as well. So hello panel, and thank you so much for joining. And of course, we appreciate that all of you watching and listening, that you are an enthusiastic and engaged audience. So please do submit your questions and comments via the Q&A box in Zoom, and I'll move them into discussion, try and make it as interactive as possible. So we've just heard the key findings from the research, and I'd like to ask each of you what stood out for you from the findings and if there was anything particularly surprising. Douglas, if I can come to you first, please, and then Denise and then Pavita.
Thanks very much. I think the thing that struck me most, when you look at the spider diagrams in the research, and it was something that Kate pointed out, there were very few areas where there were great difference between men and women, and I think that's quite an interesting observation in the sense that it kind of suggests that you can have different experience on the board without there being conflict because people aren't coming at it from a very different perspective. I think the other thing that struck me and was the importance in a way of lived experience. If you think that people have been put on boards to do a particular role because of a particular skill, I think if you were marking our scorecard in diversity, and the two boards I chair are, one of them is 50-50 non-execs, female and male, and the other non-execs is 4 women and 2 men. But if you look at the research finding in terms of director roles by gender, the majority of female roles were in CSR, remuneration, designated NED, and therefore to some extent more functional and more, this is the wrong word, but I think you know what I mean, more in the kind of the human side, the softer side of boards, and more, the male roles were more on executive, the audit committee, CFO, CEO, and I think to some extent that flavors the finding. It was interesting that I'll make a kind of a stupid comment in a way. It was interesting that women were more critical of HR than men when most HR directors are women. And I think, again, that reflects something. Women are more likely to be critical of women than men are likely to be critical of women because they don't want to be seen to be stereotypically chauvinistic. But I thought it was interesting how few differences there were when you really got into it. And I thought it was helpful research.
Thank you for those opening thoughts, Douglas. Denise, if I can come to you, please.
Yeah, good morning, everyone. Look, a really important piece of research, and I think it's taken the case beyond characteristics and women into thinking and thought process, and actually the qualities and the focus that they bring to the board that is different. And I think that's an important sophistication, actually an important development on the role of women on the board. What struck me, I guess I'm not surprised at the findings that women are more collaborative, more keen to have longer meetings, more keen to mix with colleagues outside the board, or that they have a greater focus on culture and employee engagement. The one that slightly interests me, which I don't think is in the full report but didn't come out on the slide, is that women have a different focus on customers and a different view on how the board performs as regards views on customers. And we've always known that one of the benefits of gender balance on boards is to reflect the communities that businesses serve. and specifically around stakeholders, key customers. And I think it's interesting to see, for me, that actually now women will be starting to bring hopefully a greater focus on customers, because once customers are aware of this topic and they're using it as a differentiator as to where to go, where to shop, what to buy, a company that performs well on gender balance versus other things, then I think we're really in game-changing space. I haven't quite got there yet, but that's where we need to be moving, and what I'd like to see in the next few years.
Thanks, Denise. And Pavita, same question to you. What stood out for you from the research?
Thank you, and good morning, everyone. A really helpful piece of research. I think one of the things that I would be encouraging the team to do is send it to all the chairs across the FTSE. So I think it'd be very helpful for chairs to think about how this plays out and their own board dynamics. Like Denise, we've been at this for a long time, looking at the dynamics in boards, both at the board level and at the exco level. So I wasn't really surprised by specifically any of the themes, because I think it mirrors what we see all the time. But the one I suppose I was struck by that I didn't expect to see was the fact that women were 3 times more likely to be thoughtful and mindful about the representation, for example, of ethnic minorities and broader diversity, such as social mobility, age, and other issues. And the reason I say that, we've been at the gender progress agenda for, gosh, nearly 15 years now, many of us. But in the last 5 years, there's also been a lot of focus on race, and we've had, the Parker Review and the requirement to have a leader of ethnic minority background on every FTSE 100 board. So I was really struck that it was more likely to be women that noted that and noticed it rather than men. And for example, at 30% Club, we've broadened our goals from beyond gender to also include race, all women. And it just really made me think about, how do we ensure that all board members, not just the women, are thinking about those issues?
Thank you all for those opening thoughts. And a key takeaway from this research is both men and women do bring something different to boards. So I think that that's in itself is, I think it's something that we have always thought anecdotally. I think it's something that we've always assumed, but this is trying to really evidence that quite actively. How does that resonate with your experience of board dynamics? Maybe Denise, if I could come to you first.
I think it, as Pavita said, I think it really just gives the academic rigor to what we've always known and thought. But one of the very good things about this is now we're seeing far more women come through into chair roles, women come through into SID roles, not just 40% women representation across the board, 30% women SIDs. And the qualities, the different insights, the different focus is bound to be good. I mean, the changing needs of boards from where we were a decade ago to now is light years. Boards need to see a much broader cadre of skills. If you look at some of the issues that are facing boards today, the need to understand Gen Zers and their changing expectations of leaders in the workplace. If you look at Roe versus Wade, if you operate in the States, if you look at mental health issues through COVID and the pandemic, and the very change in home working, all of these are issues that were not on the board table even 5 years ago, I might say. And so a board having the strength of gender balance with people with different interests, different focuses, being differently informed and educated on these topics can only be good for British business. It has I think we're now seeing almost the proof in the pudding, actually. And I see the changing capabilities of leadership continuing to broaden as we go forward in a much more complex and demanding business environment.
I think it's interesting. In the research shows this slightly different, that women focus on different issues in board discussions. And that, as you mentioned, Douglas, that there tend to be the more focused on areas that would be viewed as the softer skills, the non-financial areas. Is this a problem? So Denise, you're saying that these areas are becoming increasingly important. So I can see that there's definitely a benefit there. But are women doing the office housework? That's this is an age-old discussion, but is there a sense that they're doing this stuff that's not being picked up out by others, and they're doing it at board level? Maybe if I can come to you first, Douglas, and I'll come back to the panel.
You make a very good point, and I think it's getting a great deal better. I think one of the real steps forward in the last 5-10 years, Denise has talked about it, is the fact that the roles that women are having on boards, and indeed the experience they're bringing, is much broader. I think in the early stages it was, I hate the word softer, but perhaps in the human characteristics of boards. But now women are coming, they're CFOs, they're risk managers, they're ex-CEOs themselves. And I think that's hugely important, because projecting to the broader workforce who the board members are, and people can see that these are people that have got enormous contributions to make from really important, hard roles in their executive careers, and are now coming into it in a non-executive way. And I think that's really, really important. People, to get the progress in gender diversity that we want to see, women in the organization have got to look up to the board and sort of say, these are role models that I can relate to, and I can aspire, or have an ambition to follow. And that means that they've got to have the breadth of experience as to whether the same experience that they would look at and see from anyone that was on the board. I'm going to make a provocative comment, because I've been involved with the Mentoring Foundation for a long time, which I'm sure others have been involved with too, and I think it's a fantastic organization, helping women break through glass ceilings to the extent that these things ever. And I used to say something in panels there, and got a broad level of support, probably going to get killed today. But I used to say, I still believe it. One of women's problems on boards and in careers is they're far too honest. A woman faced with a job description, and that's why I think they're excellent boards, because the question, if they see that they have 8 out of 10 characteristics, they think that they're missing something. A man who sees 6 out of 10 thinks he's overqualified. And I think that's a gap that we have to deal with as well. There's no such thing as perfection. And I think getting over the hump that you don't need to have everything to be successful. Indeed, that's why you need diversity on boards and on executive levels, because you all bring different skills that your colleagues have, sometimes the same, sometimes more of, sometimes less of. And I think getting over that, getting that confidence factor that having 6, 7 out of 10 is more than enough to make a real contribution, is something that is progressively getting better, but is very much a gender imbalance. Men are much more confident with fewer bits of information and fewer skills than women, which is why men are more confident with less board packs than women are. And that's just a characteristic of the way minds think. If I think about my daughter's preparation for her GCSEs and A-levels, beautifully referenced files, color-coded and indexed, and my son's with the previous generation's notes at the bottom of a rugby kit bag. That just is the way it sometimes is. I can see Pavita smiling. She's probably going to kill me now. I'll stop.
Pavita?
I'm laughing because my son's just gone off to his last GCSE, and that's exactly what he was like. So I completely concur. Look, I think this thing about soft, it's a really interesting word, but I don't subscribe to it. No. Describing skills that are the harder stuff, effectively. I think it is the harder stuff on boards. And we've seen in recent years that actually culture matters more than anything. The pandemic taught us the CEOs who really won were the ones that really paid attention to culture and shifted quickly to new ways of working. I think what we've seen in the CBI recently is that culture at the top of organizations matters. And okay, we recognize that some women have a predisposition to being able to pay attention to this stuff, but the risk is that if chairs just assume the women are going to take those caretaking jobs, that doesn't solve the problem. So I think it's important for chairs to think about not just assigning what you described, I think, as sort of the housekeeping work to women. So, for example, being the representative for the workforce, being the people that go out, the representatives that go out and meet individuals in terms of talent or affinity groups. I think it's really important those roles are shared across the whole of the board. But the most important thing for me, I think, is that of the various stakeholder groups, the ones who win the most by seeing a balanced board beyond the shareholders or customers or anyone else is the workforce, because they look up and they see balance on the board and they say it's not just one woman, but as you know, as Denise said, in many boards now it's 40% or more, and they think that's great. This is an environment or an organization that I can see myself getting to the very top, and representation really matters.
Yeah. Can I just add to that, Yasmine? I absolutely agree with that, Pavita. I think we need to, and this is always, you know, this is very hard, and this is the difficult cultural change. We need to sort of flip this conversation on its head, really. And rather than thinking that the male dominance on the board model is the right one, i.e. smaller board packs, and maybe what women are bringing is not so valuable. Actually, I believe it's the opposite, and that women are now, with the focuses we've discussed and the different changing skill sets, are plugging a gap that's been there for far too long. So actually, they are making boards better performing, more rounded, more thoughtful in their decision making, better informed in their decision making through their challenge, and you know, rather than the women fitting into the male model. I just think we need to sort of rip that piece of paper up and say it's a different world now, and for far too long we haven't benefited from the skills of all of the population, and specifically those that are around culture, employee engagement. That are critical, particularly in today's world.
I think, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to say, what's improving that is that the lived experience, the breadth of skills that people are bringing into the workplaces. So there's a much more diverse talent pool to choose from than there was 10 or 15 years ago. So the talent pool to choose from, I mean, when we did our last board selection at Aberdeen, we took 3 out of 4 candidates. The shortlist got down to 4, and I criticised the headhunter for lack of diversity, because of the 4 candidates, 3 were women. And I said, can't we find any more men? So I mean, I think the talent pool is much broader than it ever was, because women. And then you get into all the other diversities as well, which I kind of hate, in the sense that I think tags are unimportant. It's experience, it's diversity of thought, which can come from lots of things. I mean, how we are ever going to deal with social economic background in terms of a characteristic, I find very difficult, but it's very relevant for very many industries that are reaching a wide customer base.
I can see Sophie Hume from Progress Together is joined the call this morning, so she'll be delighted to hear you say that, Douglas. And I think that it's important to also think about, well, that talent pool that you've just mentioned. If we look at the sex segregation across roles, so for example, if I look at the data that we did for the HM Treasury Women in Finance 5-year review in 2021, and we found that 28% of exco roles are held by those in what we refer to as support roles. So that's things like head of HR. It includes sort of basically non-P&L functions. And what we found is that the head of HR was an exco member in 6% of organizations. This is financial services sample. And where a head of HR was an exco member, 80% of the time they were female. So we have, and this is not news, and Denise, this is widely explored as well, obviously through the FTSE Women Leaders research, and it certainly reflects what we found. But when we have that sex segregation, it's not surprising then that's the knowledge base, and then that's where the influence comes. I've had an interesting comment from Birgit New. Hi, Birgit. A lot of the work on preparing people for leadership and board positions is focusing on women needing P&L experience. Isn't the converse equally true, that more men should be rotated into these wider areas, particularly as they're getting more attention from wider stakeholders, investors, regulators? And she said, victory is not ours if women are half the boards but still doing the less valued work. And I think that speaks very much to the point that you were making, Denise. that we really need to shift the default in our thinking on the subject. I guess my question back to you, Denise, is do you think that that is happening, and what more can we do to drive that shift in thinking to around what is valued work on the board?
I think it's a great question, and it's starting to change, but far too slowly. The perceptions again about this role is a good role, a strong role, this role isn't, and the P&L, the whole P&L debate, I find frankly frustrating and now pretty old hat. It's a debate that we had a decade ago, and as we see that the changing needs of leaders are very different to where they were then, but also we've seen the kind of traditional route. Most CEOs will come up through the finance director route. Well, that's a functional role, and it's a terribly narrow role as well, actually. But I think what we need to be looking at today is the CIO role. Technology, many businesses are technology led. We're starting to see some of the newer CEOs moving out of the CIO role. We've seen a FTSE 100 company where the new CEO was formerly the HR director. And I just think we've got to shift our views and really stop the conversation around this is an important role, this isn't. Anybody who says HR director is not an important role these days, I think they're pretty out of touch actually with the needs of the workforce and the needs of business.
Denise, do you have anything to add? How can we make more people think like Denise?
So I think I really endorse what Denise is saying, but I think there's also something about the fact that if you have had a slightly less typical background, it makes it really harder in terms of entry to the board. And so we see that particularly from people from ethnic minority background, but we saw it with women, 10, 15 years ago when we were making the drive to get women on boards. Women were stuck in this cycle. I've never been on a board, so I can't get on a board. And I had a woman say that to me yesterday. They're very capable, very successful, operated at a very senior level in a financial services institution. So I think challenging our assumptions about what does a typical NED look like, and not all chairs, I'm not suggesting that is the case at all, but many have a picture in their head about what the atypical what the typical NED will look like, and they'll have had a certain track record, they'll have had certain roles at executive level, they'll probably already be on a board. So if we want more diversity on boards, we've got to also challenge our assumption about what the role of NED is, what's really necessary, which are the roles on the board that you could take a more lateral approach and more innovative thinking about the sort of person that could populate that role.
We've had some questions coming through the Q&A box. Thank you very much. A reminder to please do any questions, any comments, please do pop them in that Q&A box. A question from Aaron Pugliese, excuse me if I've mispronounced you. We seem to be attempting to replace a traditional board model with a new, more inclusive and varied model. Do you think we should welcome the simultaneous existence of different models, or should we eliminate the traditional one? Maybe Douglas, if I can come to you first, and Denise is already smiling, so I'll come to Denise after you.
There's certainly no way you can have a cookie cutter approach. I mean, the skills and experience you need on a board depends very much on what the company's purpose is, the number of geographies it operates in, and the kind of customers it has. I mean, if you're in a business that's dealing with the public through a consumer business, it's a totally different business. If you're in a business to business selling widgets that go into a sub-assembly, it's just a different type of skill set. But coming back to the people thing, I mean, it's interesting how few companies now have an HR director, because HR sounds like the person that makes sure the payroll gets done and does a performance management system. It's now called talent or people or all sorts of different things. And I do think that one of the other frustrating observations in the study, and something I would absolutely echo throughout my very long career, is that far too little board time and strategy is spent on people succession. And I don't just mean who gets the next job, but what is the, if we think about AI today, what will the workforce look like in 5-10 years' time? What kind of skills do we need in terms of technology, in terms of the ability to use the technology that's emerging, as opposed to replacing the skills we've got today with something that looks fairly similar? And I think companies do a very, very poor job at that kind of forward strategic thinking in terms of what is their most important resource, which is skill set, which is at the moment human delivered. And you know, and I think the people directors or the talent directors or whatever we want to call them in the future are going to be even more important, because that skill set will be very different in 5-10 years time from what it is today.
I think we're definitely seeing that through the, if I think about the Women in Finance Charter data, so we ask all signatories, obviously they're financial services signatories, but I think that the thinking applies more widely across business. And we ask them, what are your top actions to achieve your target for female representation in senior management? And we initially, the huge focus was around recruitment, and it's taken a long time for them to realize they can't recruit their way to their target. But what we're beginning to see now is the early signs of much greater focus around that succession planning, both internal and external succession planning, and the not just for key roles, but also within sort of promotion rounds internally, trying to understand, well, what does our pipeline look like? And I think that they're all very much a joined set of actions. Denise, if I can come to you on this notion of the old model and a new one.
I do think boards need to challenge themselves today as to whether they are rolling over the old traditions and ways of working of the past, or whether they really have a modern, effective board process, board performance system. Are they informed enough on modern business topics? Is the structure of the conversation, which can be overly formal, and some Neds might get 5 to 10 minutes to speak in a 3 or 4 hour meeting, is all of that really getting the best out of those people around the table? And do they have the right skills around carbon neutral, around social media? I suspect if you ask many of our FTSE board members whether they have a social media account, most of them wouldn't. And yet social media is key to everything we do in business and society today. So look, I think there's a lot of shaking up to do, and that sits squarely on the shoulders of the chair. Are they really fit for purpose? But yeah, can I just pick up on a point while I have the mic around supply? And we've touched on supply of women several times in the conversation. The supply of women is not the issue. The demand for women in roles and bias in the selection process is the issue. The pipeline of competent, capable women across all sectors of business is now, and this wouldn't have been the conversation a decade ago, but is now absolutely full to overflowing. Getting picked is the issue for women. And we still, as Pavita said, have perspectives and perceptions on what a leader looks like or what a leader doesn't look like. If we take the FTSE 350 stats from last year, so this is at a very, very evolved stage of this process in British business of trying to achieve gender balance, of all the appointments on boards and in leadership teams that were available last year in the last 12 months, 6 out of 10 of them still went to men. So 60% of all appointments are still going to men, despite the perceptions that it's all about women.
And actually, we found the exact same numbers, Denise, when we did the analysis that I mentioned that we did for the 5-year review. 64% of new board members were men. So there might be this sort of notion that there aren't opportunities for men, but actually, and that only women are getting promoted, or and that there's a preference for women, but actually the reality in the numbers is definitely the reverse of that.
There's an unconscious, there's an unconscious bias that we need to deal with in recruitment. It's too often you see specifications for roles that are based on what you've done before. I remember when I left HSBC, being approached for a couple of things, and it sort of said, has chaired a FTSE 20 company. Well, there weren't any women that had chaired FTSE 20 companies. So, I mean, it was an exclusionary comment. If you say has worked in 3 or 4 countries, which many companies would say because they've got an international operation. International experience historically has been very difficult for women to gather because they haven't had the support network that men have had as they've built their career. So I think there's something about the way we specify roles that can be very exclusionary, unconsciously perhaps, because it defines what you've been able to do as opposed to the skills that you've collected doing different things.
We've had an interesting related question from Patricia Corsi. She's saying that as a Latin American woman sitting on a FTSE board, additionally to my executive role in the EU, especially after COVID, the areas where diversity where boards should also be looking are at geographic experience. So it's very helpful to have experienced high inflation years, for example, and technology. But bias would normally revert to older age experience traditions in crisis moments, which in times is at odds with the talent profile. So I don't know if there's a, you know, it kind of supports what you were saying, Denise, and what you've been saying, Douglas, but I guess how can we get, what's the kind of communication that we need to be, conversation that we need to be having to create that level of challenge for boards to be embracing more of these newer areas, these areas that well, they're not newer areas, but the areas that they were previously they're not less focused on, or not as high on the agenda. Maybe Denise, if I can come back to you first.
Yes, look, I think it's a sharper focus on skills and attributes and the actual experience that people have had, as opposed to a formal crib sheet that says, do they tick this box? Do they have this? Do they have the other that maybe the predecessor member have, or has been, you know, as I said, a sort of brief that has been rolled forward year on year. It's looking at, and because skills and capabilities and experiences are never the same, they're often unique, but they're very often transferable from one situation to another. And so I just think it's opening up the expectations and looking at the rounded experience of the individual and the skills and attributes that they bring, as opposed to the brief. And then we'd get more people coming, we'd widen the gate and we'd get more people coming through. Right now, it's a very narrow gate as to who gets through to a board membership, and we just need to broaden that.
Pavita, is there anything you'd like to add on that?
The thing I would challenge is that, you know, as someone who spent many, many years, over 25 years, working in really large global companies, running those talent process for who gets to be CEO, who gets on the board, I would say that often what happens is it's a very lazy process. So, you know, a COSEC will say to a SID or whoever, you know, well, we've got someone rolling off, they're coming to the end of their term, let's get in our preferred headhunter. Preferred headhunter comes along and thinks, I know the chairman really well, I know exactly what they want, and that happens a lot. And then they bring out, you know, here's one I prepared earlier, role profile of an ed. Now, I'm really categorizing and generalizing here. I'm not saying that happens in every case. And what really should happen is, what does this organization at this moment in time, in terms of what the question posed, which is, you know, is it more relevant? We have geographic experience. Is it more important? Our customer base has changed. So, for example, in the US right now, people over 50 represent 30%, 36% of the population. We're going to have more people over 50 in this country than we've got under 18s. And, you know, how often do we see older women represented on boards? Yes, but not at excos. You do not see older women walking around the C-suite corridors. And it's because many of them opt out and leave for lots of different reasons. And a younger representation on boards, you know, using shadow boards, bringing different voices in, listening to what's really happening. If you don't understand social media, where do you get that from? So Diageo have just put a much younger person on to actually represent technology and social media onto their board. So I think it's really important that every time a vacancy comes up, you really interrogate, what do we need at this moment, rather than an assumption that what we've done for the last 3 times will just replicate and recruit the person that looks exactly the same.
I had an interesting comment from Shefali Yogendra. To Pavita's point, what does a NED look like? We perhaps need a campaign of the kind the Royal Academy of Engineering did, of this is what an engineer looks like. Those of us with non-traditional backgrounds, but now on FTSE 250 boards, would gladly support it to encourage a more rich, varied backgrounds onto boards. An interesting idea to take away. We've got about five more minutes. I just wanted to go back to the research findings for a moment. These research findings are about the potential differences and the different contributions between women and men on boards. What implications do you think these findings have for executive committees? And maybe Denise, if I come to you first, and sort of as a decision-making group, and perhaps what implications do we think these findings have for other underrepresented groups on board? So obviously there's a big agenda around ethnic minorities, but if we see women falling into stereotypical roles, what does that mean for other groups? But Denise, if I can come to you first on the ExCo impacts potentially.
There's a very direct read across from board performance, board issues, board benefits of gender equality down, even more so actually, into the executive committee. So I think the findings here will be equally as relevant for those on the executive committee, and will hopefully serve to bolster and fuel the case for faster progress, because most organisations know what to do, and they understand the benefits of greater diversity in all areas. There's just a bit of a gap between knowing and doing. And some organisations have moved incredibly far and incredibly fast and sustainably, and others are still, just a few are still in the starting blocks. So hopefully this will put a little bit of oomph behind the case for gender balance, as if we should need it. And I think the point on wider diversity is a very relevant one. Again, I think it reinforces the case. You know, we need this to work for all forms of diversity. There's a much better understanding in business now of the benefits, but we've still got a long way to go, and we've still got to build on that. And this will help.
Part of that is the same conversation, though, surely, Denise, around what is valued work. So therefore, what's a valued contribution on the ExCo?
Yeah, and that conversation plays out at large on the ExCo, and we've just got to flip the thinking on the head that all roles are valuable, all roles are equal, and there's not this soft role, this soft skill, this, you know, women are more suited to this, that. You know, when we started this, there was 70% men in FTSE 350, not even a decade ago. 70% of FTSE 350 HRDs were men. Nobody thought that was a bad thing, or they weren't doing a good job, or they were small, soft roles. And many of those men moved on to bigger, better jobs, and some are CEOs now. So it is massively about changing the conversation. You know, one of the observations that we've had is wherever women move strongly into the space in terms of representation, that becomes slightly undervalued there. You know, again, treading back to the early days, there were many chairs, FTSE chairs, who thought women didn't have the skill set, weren't capable of sitting on boards. And now that there's 40% of them, there starts to be this conversation of, well, the roles that women are in aren't quite the valued ones. It's this one that's the really important one. And, you know, these are big business leader jobs when we're talking about boards and leadership they are our biggest jobs in British business, and they all matter. And we just have to start thinking a bit differently.
It's a very valid point, and well researched and well documented in the academic literature about the areas that women go into end up being the pay decreases over time.
Exactly.
And a classic example of this is in education. So where we have, for example, in the primary area, we have absolutely overwhelmingly female educators in the primary system, and pay has gone down, and it's now just not very attractive for men at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, and where you do have men, they tend to be the head teacher.
Yeah, quite. And we saw this in the FTSE Women Leaders results that we published earlier this year. We had 37%. It's now actually up to 40% women in the SIDS role, in the Senior Independent Director role, which is a huge success and huge accolade for British business. But actually, you know, we spend a lot of time preparing for all the naysayers who will go, this SIDS not the important role though, is it? We've just got to stop that. We've got to change that conversation.
Pavita, is there anything that you want to add around the implications for this research for other sort of high-level decision-making groups, be it the ExCo, be it senior leadership teams, and for other diversity characteristics, not just about women versus men?
So I think the phenomenal progress in the UK on representation of women on boards is outstanding. You know, I think we're number 2 in the world, Denise, aren't we?
Yeah.
So it's phenomenal. So and many people, including male chairs, advocates, you know, government bodies, all sorts of people, the sort of work that I've been doing, Denise doing, all sorts of organisations have had an impact on that. But we are stubbornly stuck at the ExCo level at around 25% and have been for over a decade. So I think we have to ask ourselves, with all of that amazing power and focus on the board, we managed to make a shift. We haven't done it at ExCo level. So you have to argue that if you can see the benefit and chairs are talking about the impact that a more balanced board is having on better business, then why can we not replicate the same thing at ExCo level? And it's complex. There are many reasons. Part of it is some of the reasons that have already been discussed here today about the roles that women go into, but it's often because the mass exodus of women from the workforce just below that level, and a lot of that's down to culture. It's a lot of it's about why women should stay, will they stay, and we know that 30% is a tipping point, and there isn't enough women on many ExCos. So that's what we really need to focus on.
Thanks, Pavita. And Douglas, do you have any final comments around the implications of the research for other top-level decision-making groups and other diversity characteristics?
I think it emphasizes, reinforces to boards and certainly to those who plan succession that we need to do a lot more to make sure there are not barriers for people of all diversity, or just anybody, to be honest, to get to the roles that they want to get to. And I think that, I guess, one of the things that is a positive in terms of opening up more senior roles to people that have a different work-life balance because of other pressures or aspects of their life is the pandemic showed that we can do a lot of what we do working from home or using Teams, all that kind of stuff. And therefore, being in the office at all times of day and night is no longer necessary for men or women, for anyone. And I think that opens up roles to people that just simply haven't had the opportunity to be there at all times of day in the way that those who've had a support network at home, which is typically men. My daughter did her dissertation at university on bias in academia, and it was men had much greater ability to write articles that would be cited in research because someone else was doing the work in the evening with the family, that they could write the research. And faculty meetings were on a Friday evening or after work, and that didn't work for women. So there all these sort of really stupid things are being broken down. But for all my career, it's been very difficult to get above 25, 26% at the executive level. And we need to do something of that. Whether we can get it beyond 30, 40%, I don't know, for all the kind of social cultural issues, but we can surely do better than 25%. And I do think there's a real need for stop defining people by their roles. When I said soft, please don't let me think, don't anybody think I think these roles are soft. If you think about some of the skills you look for in a chief executive, the ability to negotiate, the ability to deal with stressful situations, the ability to bring people alongside you when they start off with a different view, there's probably no role in an organization that does that day in, day out than the people role. But we tend to say that's an HR director, as opposed to say that's someone who spends all their time negotiating difficult situations, bringing people around to the right way of thinking, counseling people as to how they should get better, or counseling people to go and take a different career. But we tend to pigeonhole by the job title as opposed to what did you learn within that job? What did you actually do? And I think we need to get better at that.
And what you've just described is basically being a parent, Douglas.
Well, I am a parent. I'll let my children judge whether I'm a good one or
But thank you so much to the panel, to Douglas, to Denise and Pavita. I think the short answer here is that we need to find some innovative ways to knock chairs and CEOs' heads together to really try and shift the default thinking on traditional models and what kind of work that they value in decision-making groups. Back to you, Neil.
Thank you, Yasmine, and thank you to our panel. I think everyone attending will agree that was such an interesting conversation. Pavita's point, her objection to describing skills around people, culture and behaviours as soft because that stuff is harder, that really resonated with me. And funnily enough, it's borne out in our data. All of the people metrics that we measure in our index fall in the bottom half of the index. So that is just an example of something that resonated to me. Before we close, some thanks are in order, obviously, to our panel for such a rich and interesting discussion. Secondly, to Laura and the wider team at the 30% Club. They've been a great partner to have alongside us for this piece of research. I'd also like to extend particular thanks to Birgit New, whose invaluable advice has helped us hugely. She's a real thought leader in this space. So special thanks to you, Birgit. And last but not least, a big thank you to the wider team at Lintstock, who've done an awful lot of work on the various stages of this study to bring all these data and insights to life. So we'll now wrap up. Thanks for attending. We will make a recording available in due course. And so at Lintstock, we run lots of seminars like this on a whole host of different topics for NEDs, for chairs, for COSECs and other governance professionals. So if you'd be interested in more details about those, then please let me know. My contact details are in the webinar email you received this morning. Thank you and goodbye.